Today I'm speaking with Willoughby Britton and Jared Lindahl. Willoughby is an assistant professor of psychiatry and human behavior at Brown University Medical School and an assistant professor of behavior and social sciences in Brown's School of Public Health. And she's also the director of Brown's Clinical and Affective Neuroscience Laboratory. And Jared is an assistant professor in Brown University's Department of Religious Studies and director of the Humanities Research Track in the Clinical and Affective Neuroscience Lab. Both Willoughby and Jared have published a series of papers on the casualties of meditation, people who have been destabilized in one way or another through the practice, often on intensive retreat, but not always. So I wanted to bring them on to talk about this phenomenon and to help point the way to resources for anyone who might be having a negative experience, either using the Waking Up app or doing any other meditation practice. And Willoughby and Jared have created a nonprofit for this purpose called Cheetah House, CHEETAH house.org, where they offer resources and even counseling to people who have been harmed in some way by the practice of meditation. So I wanted to have Willoughby and Jared on to talk about these experiences, and also we just talk about what may or may not be normative in the way in which we think about meditation's underlying purpose. For instance, how should we understand the claim that the self is an illusion? In what sense is it true? In what sense is it a good thing to be seeking to experience the mind in this way? And how does this relate to some of the negative and destabilizing experiences some people can have doing the practice? So anyway, we get into all that, and I found it a very interesting conversation. And now I bring you Willoughby Britton and Jared Lindahl. So this should be interesting. I think we're going to talk mostly about the dark side or the potential dark side of meditation practice, mindfulness practice in particular. And Willoughby, I know I've mentioned you somewhere. I think I mentioned you just in an endnote in my book, Waking Up. I mean, you kind of came across my radar, 4 years ago or so, as really the only person who was focusing on the casualties of meditation. And then, Jared, I came to be aware of you later than that. And so this should be interesting because I think that the jury's still out on many, many questions related to what is optimal in terms of training attention. But so before we jump in, I just want to get backgrounds on both of you. So starting with you, Willoughby, can you tell me what your academic background and focus now is professionally, and then maybe also describe how you got into meditation and what your background is
Sure.
there?
So, in terms of my academic titles, I am the director of the Clinical and Affective Neuroscience Lab at the Brown University Medical School, which is part of the Department of Psychiatry and Human Behavior. I also have an appointment in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences in the School of Public Health. I'm a clinical psychologist, primarily looking at the neuroscientific basis of different meditation practices. I specialize in practice-specific effects, moderators of treatment outcome, what types of factors influence how people respond to different types of practices. And those could be, psychological factors, they could be practice factors, they could be contextual factors. I'm also a long-term meditator for 25 years or so, and I'm a mindfulness instructor teacher.
Nice. You must have sat intensive retreats at some point.
Yep.
And did you have any negative experiences that are the cause of your interest in the possible dark side of meditation?
I've had a range of different types of experiences. I've certainly had my share of difficult ones. I'm sure that plays a role in this research, but I study meditation, both the benefits and the drawbacks, and I want to have just a full picture of the story and not just a biased picture of the story, which unfortunately tends to characterize our field.
Right, right. Okay, Jared, what about you?
So, my background is in the history of religions. I have a PhD in religious studies, and my focus during the latter half of my PhD was on comparative contemplative practices across Buddhist and Christian contexts. And part of the methodology that I was adopting for that was some new approaches in the cognitive science of religion by looking outside of religious literature and religious data to basic data around, how we process sense data, for instance, or how meditation affects cognition. And I was using some of those other theoretical models in an attempt to approach comparison anew and effectively attempt to account for some similarities that I was seeing across practice contexts, not by referring to, either some perennialist notion of the sacred that all of these people were independently encountering, but rather by an appeal to embodiment. And so it took a fairly like a biocultural approach to the study of religion, thinking about how contemplative practices engage embodiment mechanisms of cognition and perception and how that relates to types of experiences that are reported. So that particular work was focused primarily on descriptions of experiences of light and luminosity, as well as luminosity as a metaphor for consciousness in different contemplative traditions. And it's actually through that research that I met Willoughby for the first time. And one of the early publications that came out of our research on the Varieties of Contemplative Experience project was a paper on different types of light experiences that were reported in that sample. Over time, after I finished my PhD and took various academic positions, I was continuing to collaborate with Willoughby on the Varieties project and kind of took over directing that, finishing up the interviews with other colleagues that helped us with that project, working on coding and analyzing the data, and then 5 papers that have come out so far, and there's a couple other in the pipeline at the moment. So my work also has generally, in the last half of a decade or so, focused primarily on this range of experiences associated with meditation that we documented in the Varieties of Contemplative Experience study. But given my background in academic training, I'm particularly interested in the interpretive and cultural issues, the question on how experiences are appraised, how meaning is made of them, especially given that the people we interviewed in the West were often juggling multiple epistemological frameworks from, biomedicine and science on the one hand to traditional Buddhism on the other. How those things play out, I think, is a big part of the stories that we've documented through this study.
Yeah, yeah. We're going to talk about framing effects, I'm sure. And so you have a background in mindfulness practice as well. Have you sat silent retreats?
Yeah, sure. So my background is less in mindfulness-based programs like MBSR and MBCT, more studying through different Buddhist lineages, Tibetan Buddhism, I guess primarily, but I've also done some short Zen retreats and studied with some Theravada teachers and had a fairly ecumenical approach to the practice of Buddhism for, I don't know, 20 years or so now. Yeah,
Oh, great. Okay, and you guys are married too, which is a happy outcome of this interest of yours.
indeed.
Nice. So I have 2 papers of yours here. We'll talk about your work in general, I'm sure, but if people want to read the papers that have inspired this conversation, there's one by Willoughby titled, "Can Mindfulness Be Too Much of a Good Thing? The Value of a Middle Way?" And then there's a paper that you jointly wrote titled, "I Have This Feeling of Not Really Being Here: Buddhist Meditation and Changes in the Sense of Self." Both of these bring up many interesting issues. I think let's start with the first, Willoughby's paper here, just to focus on one point, which is the idea that even if meditation or mindfulness specifically is good for you, it could be like many things where its goodness follows an inverted U-shaped curve. So it's, as you say, not a monotonic function. So it can get better and better and better, but then you reach some optimum past which, if you go, things get worse. And perhaps, Willoughby, you want to just talk about that situation a bit.
Sure. So I got the idea and the title from a paper that Adam Grant wrote on Aristotelian ethics. And he empirically demonstrated that things that we generally think are good things, like patience, courage, honesty, these are all things that are non-monotonic, meaning that at some point you can have too much of them. And I think if we, use those examples, you can have too much courage and be foolhardy. You can have too much patience and life goes on without you. And it goes on. And he shows that that's true ubiquitously, that this inverted U-shaped curve is a ubiquitous principle of both psychological and physiological processes. And at the very end of his paper, he says there's a couple other candidates that need to be investigated for this, nonlinear, non-monotonic kind of principle, and mindfulness is one of them. And so I kind of he passed the torch and I took it on from there to look at various dimensions of mindfulness and to see whether that same principle, that are there certain dimensions of what we know about mindfulness and other types of contemplative practices that can be too much of a good thing under certain conditions, with certain people, or that there might be a trade-off to certain types of self-cultivation. So I think you can read the paper, but I think some very obvious examples are things like emotion regulation. So I think many of us get into contemplative practices or mindfulness because we have a lot of emotions that are maybe a little more than we wanted. Too much anxiety, depression, sadness. We want to have less emotion. And I think there are certain practices and dimensions of practice that are very good at doing that. And we see from the neuroscience studies that lots of practices increase prefrontal control over the amygdala and the limbic system and really downregulate our emotional responses. And that's a really positive thing. And then, that's all true. And there are also people that are reporting that they've lost all emotions altogether and they don't feel pleasure anymore. And that is completely consistent with the downregulation of the limbic system and the amygdala. If you continue that trajectory of downregulation, at some point, you will not only have less negative emotions, but you'll also have less positive ones, or no emotions at all. And I think in the most recent paper, we shared a story about a woman who no longer felt affection for her children. So I think that we need to think about and play out a lot of the benefits to their furthest possible. If this kept going, what would it look like? And I think it makes a lot of sense that this U-shaped curve sort of explains the boundary conditions of when mindfulness is optimal and when it might go beyond, we might cultivate or overtrain beyond optimal conditions.
Some of these effects are situational, so that obviously if we were training our soldiers to be compassionate and patient and self-reflective, that could be a good thing, except, on the battlefield, it might be a terrible thing in certain circumstances because we just want them to act and kill people. And so by analogy, there are probably many situations in life where something that is optimal in one circumstance becomes an impairment of function in another. And so there are just trade-offs wherever you look that you really can't get around. I mean, and again, this applies not just to something like mindfulness potentially, but to any virtue you can think of.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're getting at one of the main principles that we discovered through all of our research, which is that the value or the benefit of something is completely context dependent. Even the same experience within the same person, even something that's supposed to be this ubiquitous, inherently positive thing like, losing one sense of self, that in one on a retreat might be very blissful and wonderful, and off retreat or in other situations is actually the cause of a lot of suffering. So I think, yeah, that was one of our main conclusions, was the context specificity of our findings.
Well, beyond context specificity, I guess I'm worried about whether we're always talking about the same thing or even ever talking about the same thing when we compare people's experiences with these terms like mindfulness or loss of self. And even in the case of mindfulness, you may get different outcomes and different side effects or different contraindications depending on how you're practicing it. There's a question about whether heightened awareness, merely heightened awareness of experience is masquerading as mindfulness in some of these studies, right? Because, mindfulness, at least in my framing and really, I think the only construal of it that makes sense based on the teaching is that it has to include an acceptance of and fundamental non-reactivity to what's appearing in consciousness, right? It can't just be heightened, agitated awareness of what's appearing in consciousness. But in certain cases, it's possible that just heightened awareness is being reported as mindfulness, or mindfulness training is leading people to have merely heightened awareness that is not at all equanimous of, say, bodily symptoms. And then that aside, it might really matter whether you're successfully training mindfulness on interoception, just the sensations internal to the body as opposed to the nature of awareness itself. And this is something that I know you have focused a lot on. Again, this is a fairly inside baseball consideration, but you focused a lot on the what are called the dark night experiences people have along the progress of insight in certain types of mindfulness practice. And I think it's an open question whether one has those dark night experiences, which is to say negative experiences that signify progress along the path, if one is focusing on open awareness rather than on, minute sensations in the body.
Yeah, I'll have a few things to say about
Sure.
that. I mean, I generally agree with you that practice-specific effects are really important to look at. There is a lot of confusion around what mindfulness is. It's a pretty multidimensional construct, at least how it's been employed in mindfulness-based programs. It's multidimensional within Buddhist traditions as well. So certainly some would argue that, following you, that it includes something like acceptance and non-reactivity. Others might say, no, non-reactivity is really equanimity. That's a different construct. And yeah, we're trying to cultivate both of those, but they could perhaps be teased apart. So I think there is a tremendous amount of variability in how people practice meditation, in exactly even maybe people within the same type of program or retreat, when they're hearing instructions, we often assume that they're just implementing them in the same way, but there hasn't been a lot of really good research on, how people are practicing and how changes in practice approach can really impact the trajectory of one's experience. Certainly in the Varieties of Contemplative Experience project, we saw that a lot of feedback that practitioners would get or implement themselves when they encountered difficult, stages of practice or just had challenges in general was a shift in practice approach, and in some cases a shift in practice type altogether, perhaps with the intention of kind of rebalancing principles of one's experience that got kind of out balance. And I think you're right that one of those things could be, really heightened perceptual awareness, for instance, without a grounding compensatory equanimity. I think we could probably from there theorize what kinds of difficulties might come from that state of heightened arousal. I think so too. You could have the converse where you have, so much equanimity and diminished affect and diminished emotions that too, if practiced without a compensatory, balancing principle, could lead to other types of experiences that we documented. As far as the so-called dark night, which is really a very contemporary term that some folks have used to refer to, as you said, certain stages of the progress of insight. Yes, that was one thing that came up in our study of challenges from those who were practicing within Theravada traditions, in which that is a major framework for how the practice of vipassana is supposed to unfold. Certainly, there were other types of challenges that Theravada practitioners mentioned that didn't really match that framework. And so, too, there were challenges across Zen and Tibetan practitioners who were doing really very different types of practices, of more of the open awareness type that you mentioned. And those could have their own types of challenges as well. And so, because we were documenting practitioners from across these kind of three major traditions of Buddhism who were doing, I think in the paper we list something like, a dozen or more types of practices, that's really, complicates, I guess, how we have to talk about challenges, because challenges are not singular, and they're certainly not all coming out of one particular practice tradition or practice approach. And that's going to intersect too with, what somebody brings to their experience and some of these other contextual factors that we were gesturing towards earlier.
Yeah, I guess I'm just going to mention a few more confounding variables here, and as we kind of spiral in on my central interest here, which is the questions about the self and whether cutting through it as an illusion is optimal and what that all means. But in reading these papers and in looking at some others, I have a kind of a global concern about population effects and just how people get recruited into these studies. So in some of these studies, you and others have solicited input from people who have had negative meditation experiences. So it's a little bit like walking into a gym and asking people, who among you have been injured, who among you have dropped weights on yourselves, come over here and tell us about your experience. And that's obviously selecting for a certain sample of people who are presumably, in this case, a much larger population of people who are getting benefits from working out and aren't necessarily injuring themselves or injuring themselves all that much. And then there's the other issue where if you compare the population of all meditators to the general population, that there are some population biases that one could anticipate there. It would be a little bit like going to everyone who's using physical therapy compared to the general population and asking, how do you feel? What's your body like? Do you have any aches and pains? And, physical therapy is obviously going to select for a population of people who are either have been injured or, are super fixated on the optimal function of their body, with all the attendant, neurotic or injury-related history there. And you would expect something similar with the population of all meditators compared to the general population. Many people don't get into meditation until the wheels have begun to come off in their lives in one way or another. So I just wonder how you guys think about those effects generally.
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. It's one that, not surprisingly, we get a lot. In the overall methods paper for the study, which also provides some of the general results of it, the one that's called The Varieties of Contemplative Experience, published in the journal PLOS One, we're pretty clear that there are a number of limitations in our study and that a lot of future work needs to be done. And certainly the sampling in the population is one thing that's worth noting. So we were intentionally sampling for people who could talk about challenges. So 100% of our sample had challenges. The reason we did this, though, is we were trying to get at a better understanding of what the range of phenomena were that people found unexpected, challenging, distressing, functionally impairing, how they interpreted it, and also how they responded to it, what helped and what didn't help in mitigating that challenge. And that was primarily done to fill this lacuna in the meditation research, which has been focused primarily or almost exclusively on positive effects. And, as, Willoughby mentioned, from experience, and, in my case, also from reading the vast corpus of Buddhist textual sources, it's clear to me that the current science of meditation is really missing out on a lot of the things that happen in the context of different contemplative practices. So the primary intention of this study is to fill that gap and identify the range of phenomena that people reported as challenging and difficult. And also then to identify some variables that we might want to look at in future research. You're right that we're very restricted in what we can conclude based upon our sampling. And we, comparisons to other meditators or to meditation, a meditation culture where you're going to have people who are having positive and negative experiences, as well as comparisons to the general population and the incidence of some of these experiences there. These are certainly things that we hope that further, more targeted, more controlled studies will be able to hone in on what's specific to meditation and what are the particular factors that might be causing them, in addition to practice-specific effects. And to that end, we also had some, to nevertheless be fairly confident that what we were reporting had something to do with meditation, we did a pretty robust causality assessment as well within the study and ruled out people for whom we could not conclusively determined that meditation was at least playing a significant role. Always, I think there's an interaction effect with other variables, but we did use standard criteria for evaluating causality, and Willoughby can say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so this was one of the biggest questions that we get is, well, how do you know that any of these experiences are due to meditation and, not due to something else? And they always refer to the problem of base rates because a lot of these experiences they happen in just life or with mental illness. And obviously those happen independent of meditation. So how do you make that claim? And there are causality assessment criteria that are used by regulatory agencies like the World Health Organization, like the FDA, the National Institutes of Health, that make health policy decisions when base rates are not known. So the first one is just are there known effects of this treatment or meditation? So we found more than 40 prior reports. This is independent of Buddhist texts, but 40 published reports in medical literature of meditation related problems. There's also the issue of expert judgment. We interviewed 32 meditation teachers or clinicians and asked them about whether they thought a certain experience or problem was caused by meditation. Then you have subjective attribution, which is just simply the attribution to the practice by the subject. Then you have challenge, which is did the experience happen during meditation or immediately following? Same thing with exacerbation of pre-existing symptoms. Did it happen during or following meditation? Then you have de-challenge, which is did the experience decrease when practice was reduced? And then re-challenge is does it reappear when the practice is repeated? Then we also looked at 3 types of specificity: subjective specificity, which is does the same experience following meditation occur on more than one occasion in the same person? And then intersubjective consistency is does the same experience happen during or following meditation in multiple people? And then cross-modal consistency, which is the same event reported as causally related to meditation by both experts and meditators. So that's a huge mouthful and a lot to remember, but I think that the point is we address the issue of causality thoroughly.
Right. Well, happily people can rewind and hear you say that 14 times in a row, and then
Right.
they'll know what ground you've covered.
Yeah, and then just to say that, every category that we reported was reported by at least 20 meditators and 5 experts as being related to meditation practice. And, the average sort of number of causality criteria that were hit by each category was more than 4. So we're pretty confident about the causal relationship with meditation. And that doesn't mean that all these other things, mental health and practice and all these things aren't related, but we are pretty confident that we have a signal here.
There's another effect here that, for lack of a better phrase, I would call the uncanny valley effect, which is if you don't go far enough in the chosen direction, you begin to experience negative effects that are the result of having not, having moved from where you were and not gotten to the goal or something like the goal. And it's hard to differentiate that kind of process from just being the frank downsides of doing a given practice. I guess you could draw an analogy yet again to something like physical exercise, where if someone starts lifting weights, but every time they get sore, they consider it a bad sign and it's just unpleasant enough that they don't want to do it anymore, and then they lay off, and then they do it again 2 weeks later, and they're sore again, and they think, well, this can't be right. There is a kind of uncanny valley there where you're just, all you're getting is soreness and no benefit, and you really have to take it further before you actually start building muscle and function. And, mindfulness could be like that, at least for certain people, and certainly any kind of unraveling of the sense of self could be like that for certain people. And then I guess that's sort of from the individual point of view. I guess from a social context point of view, I would think that if you're selecting for the most committed meditators, right, the 10,000, 30,000 hour people, you're selecting for people who have substantially devoted their lives to this practice. And that comes with, a host of associated qualities in people, especially in the West, which, if you've spent any time hanging out around spiritual communities, you'll notice that, there are many casualties of the Dharma, right? There are people who couldn't really get their lives together, or, for a variety of reasons, or in some ways couldn't get their lives together because they were so committed to Dharma practice, or so committed to studying in Asia, say, with various teachers. And, then polling all of those people about how happy and well integrated they are would also select for, just other variables, right? They didn't become Buddhas, but they became people who never got to have kids and got a bunch of tropical diseases and never fulfilled their career potential. And I mean, so like, it's a very complicated picture of what even expertise looks like in this space.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're getting at a really important point, which is that there's no perfect study and that every study has a certain sample that's going to have its own kind of effects. And I think that in the varieties of contemplative experience study, which was the first study that we attempted, we made some decisions about sample for a variety of reasons. And there are, I think, strengths of those choices and also drawbacks. So, on one hand, sort of addressing the idea of like, oh, I'll just stop meditating when it gets unpleasant, to some extent, that's, how many of these people just didn't know what they were doing or they weren't doing it correctly. So, we, for the first sample, we wanted to see if these difficult, challenging experiences occurred under optimal conditions where we were fairly confident that the people they knew what they were doing, they were practicing correctly. So in our sample, 60% of the sample of the meditators who are reporting their own experiences were themselves meditation teachers. To the second issue that you brought up, which is, well, those were all really overly committed people and that's going to have its own sampling bias. We did have a range of different types of practice amount. So we had some people that were, less than 1,000 hours. We had people that were more than 10,000 hours and everybody in between. So I think we do have some sense of, a range of beginners versus experts. It's probably higher on the expert type of thing. And I think, we need to do more research. No research is final, and we need to do more research looking at shorter amounts. And, but we were biased in the expert direction for sure. And I think, one of the other sort of sampling effect problems is that the meditators that we found were, really not representative at all of the U.S. population.
Mm.
They were probably 3/4 of them had graduate degrees. So we're talking like the top 1% of,
Neurotics.
yeah, 1%, very, very high achieving, predominantly white, very, very educated, extremely privileged. And so, if we're looking and if it's happening to those people, more than half had no psychiatric history. More than half had no trauma history. So that is not representative of either the US population or, lots of different types of demographic groups. So I think we can, if anything, probably expect more problems with people who have more marginalized, less privileged existences.
Right, right. Okay, so as we approach kind of the main topic here of the nature of the self, I'm just wondering what advice you would have for somebody. Let's just remind ourselves of the context in which people will be listening to this conversation. So people are using the Waking Up app, and some are very experienced meditators, some are new to the practice, and now we're talking about the possible downsides of practice, and in a fairly impressive context of uncertainty about how all this information may relate to any given individual. What do you, and perhaps this is best pitched to you, Willoughby, as a clinician, what do you recommend people do with this information? And how do you recommend they think about just changes in their own experience in their practice in light of the possibility that some type of practice or some amount of practice might not be good for some people, and they have to figure out whether they're one of those people.
Right. And I think that that's part of the first step is to realize that a lot of the way that meditation is marketed in a way that sounds like it's good for everyone. Where, I think the most accurate thing you could say is all practices are beneficial for some people some of the time. Of course, that's not very sexy and it probably doesn't sell apps very well, but that's really kind of true. And that's also true of science. We base our scientific findings on averages. And if the average is like a tiny bit, a little bit better than, the control, then we say, we make this proclamation that meditation works. Where in reality, in every study, there are some people that didn't benefit and there are people that got worse as well as people that benefited. So I think people need to understand and sort of retranslate what they're hearing and use that as their baseline, which is that there are lots of different practices. A lot of them are these are things to try out and see if they're beneficial for you. And if not, then try something else. And I think where it gets complicated is when the practices get mixed with religion and they get mixed with truth claims. And I think that people need to realize that these are highly contested topics, both within the religions and within science, and that, they should really trust their own experience about what seems to be having benefit for them. And exactly how long you should put up with distress and impairment, I think, again, is a really individual choice. If you've taken a year off to delve into meditation and see what it can do for you, you might have a month to spare of not being able to function. But if you're, a neurosurgeon or a mom or something that needs, you really can't afford to have any duration of impairment, then that you might make a different decision on exactly how much you're willing to put up with.
Hmm. Well, and the point you made there about conflating or entangling the practices with truth claims is something that, just need to own. I mean, that there are a variety of what I consider truth claims at the bottom of my recommendation that people meditate in the first place. And in fact, the way I frame the practice is not so much a matter of improving people's performance or de-stressing or anything else that might be a benefit for most people most of the time of doing it. It's rather often linked to what I consider to be facts about the nature of consciousness that can be discovered. And certainly most of these I consider to increase people's well-being, but there's some areas where it would be interesting to discover these things even if there were no connection to a change in a person's well-being. I would also add that the downside of doing this for some people isn't just limited to training attention with a meditation practice. It can extend to thinking certain philosophical thoughts. The most pushback I've ever gotten from my audience in the vein of, what you just said made me really uncomfortable and might have even harmed me was when I started talking about free will and its illusoriness, right? I mean, there are people who just can't stand the topic for whatever reason. And so it's just certain thoughts may be bad for you if you're a certain person, or they certainly may feel bad. And, that may be reason enough to not entertain them, right? And to just, in this case, switch off the app or, close down the YouTube video or wherever you catch me talking about topics like that. And certainly I would consider the illusoriness of the self and the illusoriness of free will to be the center of the bullseye for some people, which is just they don't want to hear about it, or upon hearing about it, they feel the risk of being destabilized in a bad way, not a way that leads to any kind of freedom. And, I don't know if you have thoughts about that as a clinician, Willoughby, but again, this is an effect I notice that has nothing necessarily to do with meditation. It's just me talking about certain topics.
I'm actually going to start, if that's all right, with the
Go for it.
response to that. Yeah, so I think it's worth keeping in mind both the intentions that people bring to a meditation practice and the context that they find themselves in. And I think I'll probably end up saying something similar to what you said, but maybe in a slightly different way. I do agree that certainly not unique to meditation that people can become destabilized. I think the comparison with philosophical teachings is an apt one that can have consequences as well on how people think about themselves and about their world. And in many ways, that might be more accurate to how Buddhists have practiced meditation historically, and that it's primarily monastics, and even then, a small portion of them that were really undertaking these practices with real seriousness and with a real intent of really changing fundamentally their experience of self and world, and that it was a really dedicated and committed undertaking. And I think, as you pointed out earlier, one that could certainly have a number of bumps along the way as some of those shifts happen. But with the overall understanding, inherited in their context and passed down through the tradition, is that that's worth pursuing in line with the intention and the goals, of being a Buddhist monk. And I guess what is interesting to me, and I think slightly distinct or novel to our current contemporary situation, while we did have some monastics in our study, or people who were former monastics, a lot of people who are doing Buddhist meditation these days, and I would venture to guess the vast majority of people who are using your app are not monastics, and they're not undertaking this necessarily as a lifelong commitment to deep existential and epistemological shifts, and you're willing to, or understanding even, the possible commitment to unraveling one's ordinary or habituated way of being in the world in a way that could be short-term or long-term rather destabilizing. So to that extent, I think what we offer in the varieties of contemplative experience study is both sort of a reality check on the varieties of things that can happen in the context of meditation, but also hopefully a bit more along the lines of informed consent for meditation users in general, irrespective of context. And certainly we need to do a lot more research on what types of things show up in different contexts. And if it turns out that the data that we documented in our particular sample really doesn't apply to the vast majority of app users, the vast majority of mindfulness users, that will be interesting and worth noting. If it turns out that certain phenomena continue to be challenging even in those contexts, and even with radically different intentions around well-being or emotion regulation or strengthening attention, and not the intention of Buddhist notions of salvation and self-transformation, then I think that that's also going to be important and worth considering, and should, we hope, feed into how people are presenting meditation as offering both real benefits and potentially some drawbacks, so people can really know what they're getting into. I think as where we are now in the transmission of Buddhism to the West, our knowledge is fairly impoverished in that respect. And I think a lot of people maybe underestimate the significance of how much these practices can affect their lives, both in positive and negative ways.
And just on the point of context, the types of negative effects you've seen and reported in your papers, can you estimate what percentage of those come from people who are doing intensive retreat versus people who just have a daily practice?
Yeah, so we can say generally about the people who reported difficulties. In some cases, the interviews included narratives about things that happened in retreat versus other narratives that happened in the context of daily practice. And correlating it with specific experiences, it's not something we're fine-grained enough to do. But when we asked everyone in our sample whether their main period of difficulties that they reported happened in the context of retreat versus daily practice, 30% of them reported their difficulties in the context of daily practice, 70% in the context of retreat. 25% of the sample was doing less than an hour a day of practice, whereas 41% of the sample was doing more than 10 hours a day of practice. So it certainly is the case that there were more people in our sample who were doing intensive retreat practice in the context of their main difficulties, but there were also, I think, a considerable number of people for whom that was not the case, and they had difficulties in the context of daily practice, even less than an hour a day.
But those people who were doing the daily practice, were they also people who had sat intensive retreat? These are virtually all intensive retreat sort of people who said that they had some of their bad experiences when they were off retreat doing their daily practice?
Not necessarily. I'm sure that there were people who would fit that description, but no, I think there are also people in the study for whom they hadn't gotten to the point of doing many intensive retreats yet.
Right. Well, I should probably just reiterate a disclaimer here. If anything we're talking about here, or anything that I talk about elsewhere in the Waking Up course, or any period of practice provokes something in you, the listener, that worries you, by all means, stop doing this and consult a mental health professional who hopefully knows something about meditation practice, and pursue the inquiry along those lines. I am increasingly mindful of the possibility that there's some percentage of people for whom what is good and has been good for me and others I know, this would just be a long list of contraindications, and there's just no way to evaluate that from the outside. So, user beware. So now we're going to talk about some of the kinds of things that make many people uncomfortable, and frankly, I don't know that anyone else is doing this in other meditation apps. I mean, it's possible, but I don't know that apps like Headspace and Calm are pushing hard on the door of the self, which from my point of view is the actual purpose of meditation traditionally, and just personally speaking, it's always been my purpose. And as you point out in your paper on the topic, I have this feeling of not really being here, which again lists a lot of the casualties of this, or describes in very kind of short case study form, the casualties of this kind of practice. We can mean many different things by the term self, and you run through a few that I'll just list them here. You talk about the narrative or autobiographical self, the sense of ownership, the sense of agency, which is a kind of ownership of action, the sense of embodiment, and something that you call the basic self. Maybe other ways for us to analyze this concept. I actually don't know how we would best move forward here. I mean, what do you think? I can tell you the self I think one undermines through mindfulness practice, and that has turned out to be a good thing in my case, but it doesn't map onto all of these categories. Or we can talk about what you think could potentially be normative here. I don't know. Do you guys have intuitions about how to tackle this topic?
Yeah, I think that sounds good. I think your audience would benefit from hearing what you have in mind by the self, and to the extent that we can start to talk about how it relates to some of the categories that we generated in this paper based upon our data-driven and some theory-driven analysis from cognitive science. I think that would be a logical next step.
Right.
Yeah, and I was just going to add, I mean, I think that the really drilling down and opening up this term self is really important, because there are so many different dimensions or aspects or senses of self, and you've said many times that not all of them are an illusion, and not all of them are attenuated or meant to be attenuated through practice, but often that doesn't get communicated, and you hear things like no self, no problem, and the idea of what it is that is targeted gets more bigger than it needs to be, perhaps. So I think having
Mm.
this conversation about really talking about what types of sense of self are we talking about, and how are they changing, and to be the most beneficial, and beneficial for what, I think it will really help listeners have a better sense of where things are going.
Okay, so I will just kind of build this up from what I consider to be the usual starting point for people. Certainly was my starting point as a meditator, and I think this will be familiar to most people. When you're asked to meditate for the first time, and you're given a practice like focusing on the breath, and you close your eyes, most people will feel that they are subjects inside their heads. They don't feel identical to their body down to the toes. They feel like they have a body. They feel like they're a locus of consciousness interior to the body and interior to the head, behind their eyes, behind their face. So when they're asked to pay attention to the breath, say at the tip of the nose or in the rising and falling of the chest or abdomen, they sort of feel like they're above the breath, now aiming attention down at it and struggling in competition with their capacity to be distracted by thought. They're struggling to get closer to the sensations associated with breathing. And then you say, well, then you can also notice other sensations like in the soles of your feet. Well, then they're aiming attention to the soles of their feet. And you can say, oh, well, open awareness further. You can notice sounds. Then they notice sounds out there in the world, but now I'm kind of impinging on their eardrums. And there's a subject, a center of attention in the center of this all, which it can aim, by force of will, it can aim the light of attention at any of these objects arbitrarily. And so this is the feeling of self that I think is a starting point. Whether or not you meditate, this is the feeling of self that most people take through the world. So you're out in the world and your eyes are open and you're interacting with other people and, you make eye contact with somebody and in a conversation, they're looking back at you. You feel that you are, in some sense, behind your face, implicated by their gaze. And again, not merely identical to your whole person. You don't feel like you are totally identical to your body. You feel like you're a bit of a passenger in the body. And when you look down at the rest of your body is sort of an object in the world among other objects from the point of view of attention in the head. So that's a starting point, which is, for lack of a better word, we can call the ego, which I believe is the thing that is undermined or attempts to be undermined in most paths of spiritual practice. Kind of ironically, it is also the sense, I think, albeit a false one, that gives people a kind of a common sense dualism where they think the mind is separate from the body because it feels that way. It's like the mind is associated with the body, but I can certainly imagine this subject in the head leaving when I die and going elsewhere. And it does seem to be a kind of dualism that gets grandfathered in to our first person philosophy here. And when you begin to think about the mind being identical to the brain or what the brain is doing, that begins to become counterintuitive to people because they feel like they have a unified sense of being a subject in the head. So anyway, there's much more to say about that, but that's the kind of starting point that I am targeting when I'm talking about the self being an illusion.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I think it makes a lot of sense in terms of starting point for meditation instruction. I think there's two or three things that I heard you say that I would like to just follow up on a bit, and I think relate back to this paper we've published on positive and negative changes in sense of self, because actually, as we mentioned at the outset in that paper, not every subject in our study who reported challenges in the change in sense of self. So some of these reports in this qualitative paper are actually positive experiences, and then there's some that are less so. So the sense of being a subject in the head is something that we put under the sense of embodiment, the sense of where I, so to speak, is located relative to the body schema. And we did have a couple of reports of that changing through the context of meditation. So feeling more like, one person reported feeling more like they were down in their chest or in their heart rather than in their head. And other people talking that they were even more distributed beyond the body, perhaps. The other thing that you mentioned is the notion that attention can be aimed to different places and that there is kind of an aimer of attention, which is something that I think we would think about in terms of the sense of agency, the sense of being an agent in the world. So it seems like that these are kind of two facets that you're asking people to investigate. And I think that certainly a lot of meditation instructions can be about having a sense of self that's maybe more distributed throughout the body rather than located primarily in the head. I think your comment about how, I can look at my hand, for instance, as a visual object, which might help to explain a little bit why I don't necessarily always feel as strongly in my hand as I do in my head. I can't look at my head as a visual object, whereas I can look at everything else about my body and see it as a visual object like other visual objects in the world. And that, I wonder if that kind of visual feedback that we typically have about most of our body, with the exception of our head, might help to account for why we have this kind of natural tendency to feel like we're more there whether than in other places, because we're already objectifying, so to speak, these other aspects of our body. And I think we know from a bunch of different research that to objectify a phenomenon is in part to undermine some of the degree of ownership over it. So when we take a distant step back from thoughts and emotions and see them as transient objects passing through the field of awareness, that too, that objectifying, that decentering from them lessens that sense of ownership. It lessens that sense of mindness or meanness. And this is, I think, quite clearly how Buddhists have been practicing with respect to the investigation of the not self characteristic, since some of the very early teachings. So I think that, yeah, and so too with the sense of agency, there are explicit meditation instructions on observing intention arising, and we have a good account of that, where one of our practitioners was doing walking meditation and noticed like intention and agency arising doing the walk, where the walk was just sort of happening on its own, but there was no agent or no one owning the kind of action of walking. So that too, I think, can be a sought after insight within the Buddhist tradition, to have this sense of decoupling from our typical strong sense of there is a me directing my intention or attention that kind of typically reinforces the sense of self. And it seems to have to do in part with kind of decoupling that from and allowing those phenomena, observing those phenomena arising from a somewhat distanced perspective.
There's a lot there. There's the deeper question of objectifying things and just how that relates to the most basic sense of self. But I want to focus for a second on the sense of agency, because I noticed at one point in this paper, you reported a kind of pathological experience of someone feeling, almost like everything had become an alien hand syndrome, where, they're doing stuff and there was no distinction between voluntary and involuntary behavior. And many people confuse what I say about free will to suggest that that would be the outcome. If you could be aware that there's no such thing as free will, well, then there'd be no difference between voluntary and involuntary behavior, which is just not true empirically. So noticing that intentions arise on their own, right? There's no intender who's producing them moment by moment. That does undercut the conventional notion of free will, okay? Because on some level, you don't know what you're going to intend to do next until the intention arises. But it doesn't cancel the distinction between voluntary and involuntary actions, because voluntary actions are the ones that have intention as their proximate cause, and also have a model of motor action that is bringing online a lot of error detection and correction. And you intend to reach for a glass of water, and when something goes wrong, that seems like an error that you're updating for. You have an expectation of what your hand is going to do, as you engage that motion. Whereas with an involuntary action, with a spasm where your arm just lurches out, say, you don't have the same kind of motor processing, anticipatory and self-correcting going on. So there are many neurological differences between these cases, but subjectively, for a person who's noticing intentions arise on their own, there's also a distinction between voluntary and involuntary action that doesn't suggest the existence of free will, or at least need not. So anyway, you feel free to react to that, but I want to pivot back to what you just said, Jared, about objectifying the hand. So the center of the bullseye from a meditative point of view is to notice that this is almost a way in which you can see that the self, as most people feel it, must be illusory, even just logically speaking, whether or not they can experience it directly for themselves, because anything you notice as evidence of your self, as evidence of there being a subject in the middle of experience, must appear in consciousness in some form. It must have some signature. Otherwise, you wouldn't notice it. I mean, you wouldn't describe your experience that way unless you were noticing something. And needless to say, you could never notice the loss of this something if there weren't that something there in the first place. So if you're noticing something, that something is rather like your hand in that it is an object from the point of view of consciousness. And therefore, it would stand to reason that it doesn't totally subsume what consciousness is in itself. And if you could just fall back to the position of being merely conscious, you would notice this something as a kind of object, right? And, perhaps as a transitory object. And that's what many of us have found in meditation is that, yes, consciousness itself doesn't feel like it doesn't feel like an ego, it doesn't feel like a subject in the head. And in fact, any evidence, any signature of I or ego or subject in the head is an appearance from its perspective, very much like a sensation in the hand or a sensation in the face or something more paradoxical than that, but nevertheless a something appearing in the field of consciousness.
Yeah, wow. I think we're getting kind of to the heart of the matter here. And I think we've also got two kind of separate threads that,
Yeah.
Maybe we should treat separately so that people, including myself, don't get confused and can follow this. So there's the question of the voluntary and the involuntary. And then there's the question of, if it can be taken as an object, does that mean that, it can't be, it's not real in some sense, or it's not self in some sense? So I want to ask you a question actually about the involuntary and voluntary one. I can see why you'd want to preserve that distinction where there'd be, some sense of agency undermined, but not to the point that obviously quite a few people in our study have gotten to where they had the feeling of things happening to them and this sort of breakdown of sense of agency. And I wonder if you think that could be accounted for in some ways by this inverted U principle, where there's some optimal degree of undercutting our typical really strong sense of agency and identification with the sense of agency, but that can be taken too far. And the consequence of that would be this sort of in these problems with predictive coding and efference copy that are typically there for our ordinary sense of agency. These break down and these predictions no longer play out in the correct way, such that we get mismatches in terms of what we take to be a sense of agency. Do you think that would be a way of accounting for this distinction?
I don't know, because the prospect of taking it too far doesn't totally find a place on the map here if in any given moment you can take it all the way and there's no problem. I don't know how many dimensions there are in this space, but if you can lose the sense of self utterly and function fine, right, then what does it mean to take it too far? Whereas I totally agree, you can have other experiences which are a kind of heightening of a sense of automaticity. I've actually had the experience that one person describes in your paper of doing walking meditation and feeling like I'm being propelled from behind by some force that's not me. I remember distinctly having that on retreat. The walking is happening by itself, but by itself in a way that feels kind of compulsory, or it gets a kind of momentum that has a life of its own, and it seems to be imposed on you. Like when I look back at that experience, and we have to account for the vagaries of memory here, but much of that experience was me also identified with thought around the experience, right? So I'm thinking, oh, wow, this really feels like it's happening by itself. Oh, this is weird. that's not a purely clear scene of the experience. But I would totally grant that there are ways to derange one's sense of ownership. And I could imagine alien hand-like experiences that people have doing a lot of meditation practice. And I wouldn't know what would be producing those or selecting for those, but it's hard for me to say that it's a matter of this inverted U problem of non-monotonicity because, on my map, you can actually just lose the sense of self completely and very little else need change, right? And certainly one of those changes is not an inability to differentiate a seizure from a purposeful deliberative action, say. So I don't know if that deals with your question, but
Yeah, I guess then I think we maybe are just grappling with different notions of selfhood, where I'm unclear how to reconcile the idea that you can lose the sense of self completely, but yet maintain a sense of agency, which, on our view and many others, is an aspect of what constitutes the sense of self. So it seems like you mean something more narrow and more specific when you talk about the loss of sense of self, entirely, and yet agency is preserved. So could you clarify that?
yeah. Well, so if I pay attention to just having this conversation, say, so as I'm uttering this sentence, I am aware that I have very little conscious insight into how this is happening, right? I'm following the rules of grammar to some degree effortlessly. And if I make a mistake, that is a genuine mystery to me. And if I don't make a mistake, that's also a genuine mystery to me. I mean, I just can't consciously inspect my language processing module here. And so each time I get to the end of a sentence, there's something deeply opaque about the process. And an awareness of that opacity is tantamount to an awareness that there's no self doing this. I mean, the conscious me isn't doing this on some level. Imagine all of the other things that might happen here that would seem totally weird to me and, send me running to a neurologist, right? So I could suddenly be unable to speak at all. Well, then I would know something had gone wrong. I could start speaking in tongues without having intended to do so, and I would know there was a problem. There's a range of expectations here that I, again, am unconsciously forming that if my performance deviated from them, it would signal something else going on, which would be noticeable and would be something that I would want to act on. But my actual attention to the process reveals to me that there's no conscious place from which this is being initiated. But if something else happened that was radically different, I could try to speak in French right now, which I barely know how to do. And if that intention arose, then my subsequent utterance would feel fine. It would feel like, me. But if I started speaking in French now without the intention arising, it would feel like, an alien hand experience, a real deviation from agency, that is. But I'm aware that whenever the intention arises, it is just arising, right? So the marker that differentiates voluntary from involuntary speech behavior is still intention, but intention itself simply arises.
I mean, but you are aware of the fact that you're the one talking rather than me or Jared.
Yes, but that's a difference in access, right? So I have access, over here, I have access to the contents of my mind, right? And not the contents of yours. And my utterances are associated with some signature of initiation of them, right? So if I just started blurting things out, again, it's part of this is not having things that are consciously available. So it's not like all intentions are always consciously salient, but you can imagine that if you spontaneously did something without any precursor intention, well, then that would seem pretty weird. You would know it by its absence on some level rather than its presence. And so, I mean, there are many things that, that we can become consciously aware of that have a kind of structure in their absence rather than their presence. This is actually a point that William James made in his great 2-volume work, The Principles of Psychology, but where he talked about the tip of the tongue phenomenon. And strangely, when there's something on the tip of your tongue that you can't remember, it has a kind of structure that you can interrogate because, you're trying to remember somebody's name and, your friend says, well, is it Sebastian? And you say, no, it's not Sebastian. Right? You can definitely exclude what it's not, and yet you still don't have access to the contents. And so a lot of our conscious life is like that. And I think I've never thought about this before, but it strikes me that the difference between voluntary and involuntary behavior has some of that character, whereas like the thing that is differentiating them is not something that you consciously can have in hand much of the time, but it has a kind of structure that you can be aware of when it's in the violation of it, or in transiting from voluntary to involuntary.
Right. I mean, I think some of the things that we know about agency are, go back to this sort of predictive coding and the corollary discharge and there being an error signal, and that helps us as organisms differentiate between what is self-generated and what is coming from somewhere else external to us. So like even crickets, right? When crickets are chirping, they have to inhibit the sound of their own chirp so that they understand that their chirp and another cricket's chirp is different. So even at that, invertebrate level, we have a basic, sense of self and other happening, whether that's conscious or not, who knows? But the sort of selfhood is started way, way back in early in evolution in terms of self and other. And then that also plays out, through every single sensory and motor process that we have has a self-other inner neuron that also does this correlated discharge self-other thing. And that's, so that also goes to agency, that we are able to tell whether my arm was moved by somebody else or whether I moved it myself.
Yeah, and I think those differences are preserved when one loses the sense of self that I'm talking about. But I mean, I know there are
Right.
people who have experiences where and you report at least one of them, I think, in this paper, where they can feel equally identified, or their sense of identity can extend to other people and processes. So other people moving around seem to be expressing their agency just as much as their own movements express their agency. And that, on its face, seems fairly non-functional and delusional, but I don't doubt that's an experience that somebody has had.
Right. So just to clarify to the listeners, then the loss of agency, the feeling like your movements are happening on their own without an author and without your control, or even going as far as having them feel like they're being moved by an external force. Those are things that can happen as a result of meditation practice. And you would say that that is not the type of loss of self that you are talking about.
Right.
Is that right?
Yes, and I would
Okay.
I would say that I would predict that when people are experiencing those phenomenon, they are spending a lot of time identified with thoughts, and certainly the anxiety that would arise in that context would be a reaction to the novelty or the strangeness of that experience, and that the anxiety, if that's the character of it, would be mediated by thoughts and amplifying of anxiety producing thoughts, and you'd be thinking about how, oh my God, am I going crazy? Right? That's a thought, right? And if uninspected, that leads to a very unpleasant place, right? There's the loss of self that I'm talking about is also synonymous with not being distracted by thoughts for the moment that the sense of self is lost, right?
Mm.
Moment or moments. If it lasts for a minute, well, then that minute is a period where either thoughts are not arising or they are arising and being recognized as appearances in consciousness. So if you're identified with thought and, terrified because it feels like something's pushing you from behind when you're doing walking meditation, at least in two respects, That's not the kind of loss of self I'm talking about.
So, what would your advice be to somebody who is having that loss of sense of agency, say starting in a meditation practice, but kind of continuing on afterwards?
Again, it to some degree depends on the emotional and psychological effects of the experience. And so, when I had that experience on retreat, it was entirely pleasant from my point of view. And this goes to a topic we raised in the very beginning of this conversation, Jared, just the effects of framing your beliefs about the significance of any experience. If you have a psychopathological framing of the experience, well, then that's one thing. If you have a traditional Buddhist framing and your teacher has just told you, oh, this is a sign of progress along the path, well, that's very likely another thing. Granted, things can get so weird or so non-functional that, even a traditional happy talk framing might not help you, and you would still want to go to a psychologist to deal with it. But to some degree, there's we're impressively moved around by just the philosophical assumptions or scientific assumptions we bring to these experiences.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it does make a difference. In addition to the framing, I think also coming back to something we were talking about earlier, the intention of the practitioner, their notion of the goal, their notion of what is possible along the path, and the type of feedback they're getting from their teacher and the community about that. If it's framed as, hey, this is something that happens in practice, don't worry about it, or it's a sign of progress, that's obviously going to land for somebody very differently than if there is immediate alarm and concern to intervene psychiatrically. That's gonna land differently for them. But I think there's other factors too. I don't think that that's sufficient to account for the variability, or that reaction is the sole and thinking is the sole product of what leads something to be challenging in a distressing and in an impairing way. I think certainly the nature of the experience that we're talking about there would need to be specified, but let's just stick with agency, because loss of agency, because that's what we're on at the moment. Other things that I think would be important variables would be, how long is it lasting, and what degree of control does somebody have over that experience? Can they in some way modulate it, turn it down? Can they have, through an act of will, reconstitute their sense of agency? Which maybe this is actually arguably the worst example to be using for this example of control, because obviously a loss of sense of agency is to some degree to say that you had no control. But for many of the other experiences that we documented in this study, other changes in sense of self, as well as changes in perception and emotion and physiology, duration and control are certainly contributing factors. If something is a very, very transient experience in the context of a meditation session, I think it's far less likely to maybe even be reported as a challenge or to have a significant impact if it doesn't persist beyond that into ordinary life. And here too we get back to the issue of how much is any particular person or meditation community willing to allow for some of these periods of difficulties. I think is going to be really context dependent, where again, if you're in an intensive retreat, you're planning on being there for a month, if you have this loss of agency for a couple hours or a couple of days, that's a very different story in that supportive context, hopefully supportive context, as opposed to, if you're, using the app, or you're at a meditation class and you got to go home and, drive back somewhere to work after that, and that experience is still ongoing. So I think that the context of that is also going to contribute to the ability to even frame it in a positive light or not. And it's certainly going to impact things like distress and impairment.
Mm.
I was just going to add to that in terms of this issue of, it's the thoughts about, or it's the appraisal of, or the evaluation of that is sort of the problem. And if you don't have that, then there's no problem. I
Well,
think,
just to be clear,
yeah,
Willoughby, I wasn't quite saying that.
okay.
I would just say that there were at least two ways in which that experience couldn't be the center of the bullseye for me. I mean, so there's
Uh-huh.
the functional derangement, which may be happening, but there's also just the fact that many of these experiences seem to be synonymous with this additional strain of just being identified with thought all the while about how weird the experiences are. The core
Hmm.
distinction for really any mindfulness practice is being lost in thought and being mindful, right? And if you can't differentiate there, well, then each subsequent moment where you're just identified with thought, that's not a story of what mindfulness is doing to you in that moment. It's a story of the suffering of, born of your thinking in that moment. Now, it's not to say that you didn't get pushed into some very weird space where you might have broken your brain because you were meditating too hard or in the wrong way on a 3-month retreat. I mean, to flip this around, there are many people who have very positive, seemingly very positive changes in their experience based on meditation. And there's a kind of grandiosity that they're expressing and feeling. They feel like the Messiah, right? They've come off this retreat feeling enlightened. Yet, if they were actually paying attention, they would see that they're basically lost in thought all the time about how good it is to be them. How everything is just consciousness and it's just, there's no boundary between me and the universe and blah, blah, blah. They're thinking every moment of the day and they're not aware of it. They don't have enough mindfulness to even notice that they're just telling themselves the story of their own enlightenment. So that's the positively valenced version of this.
I don't doubt that that happens some of the time. And I think I can think of a couple of instances in our study that would probably potentially fit that description. I think it's kind of a puzzle then, though, for what accounts then for if people say are engaged in this really intensive 10-day retreat and they feel like they're really concentrated, they're really on the object, they start having they've are very mindful of thought, they're arising and passing, they're not being identified with them. Something shifts, let's say they have a euphoric experience of that. I guess the question is then, why suddenly would they become so obsessed with their own thinking that they would lose that mindfulness that they had been previously so deeply entrained in, that maybe even generated or yielded to some extent some of these experiences. So that's kind of a puzzle that makes me feel like, that may explain things some of the times, but I certainly don't think that that's a comprehensive and total explanation, because some people also just have a more basic felt sense in their body or in their organism that something is off, and that might not be a reactivity, that they could maybe even be equanimous about that feeling
Mm.
of being off. But I do think that there are probably cases, so where again thoughts could perpetuate things either into distress or grandiosity. But I certainly don't think that that is the sole explanation for why an experience is distressing, and that in the absence of that, an experience would be necessarily neither distressing nor positive in the grandiose sense.
The only piece I would add there is I think people are lost in thought most of the time, even if they're practicing meditation a lot and even if they're on retreat, right? So, I mean, that's just the default state is for people to be identified with thought. And once you learn mindfulness, you can break that spell more or less at will, but the will arises whenever it does, and it punctuates what is otherwise just a fairly uninterrupted identification with an undercurrent of thought. It wouldn't be surprising to me that, even on retreat, people are mostly just thinking, but then they're also having these intense changes in their experience based on whatever concentration and mindfulness they do have.
I mean, I agree that that is typically like, so this psychological distance or metacognition of thoughts is typically what is emphasized in the sort of modern mindfulness practice, but that's only one of the five aggregates, and that all of the other aggregates, including body and emotion and even consciousness, actually, are taught to be, properly regarded as not, this is not myself, this is not mine. And so, as people are practicing that way, that is what happens. And I think probably some of the biggest benefits come, as you're pointing out, from disidentifying from thoughts or seeing that thoughts are events in the mind and not necessarily true, and we can get some distance from them. I think where things start to maybe have slightly more problems is when that is also applied to emotions. And, you can have emotions that play themselves out and people stop feeling them as their own. So they look like they cry, they have emotional expressions, but they feel nothing in terms of it being their emotion. It feels like it's happening to someone else. So I think, again, I see the U-shaped curve everywhere, and that there's, to some extent, this metacognition to understand, your own mind better so that you're not enslaved by it is sort of the early stages, the optimal part of the curve, but that can go into excess as well. And when it does, we start to get into this hyperreflexivity where we start to notice things that we're normally fused with, or they're normally in the background and they're sort of implicit. And then they start to become more objectified or more explicit. And then the entire balance of our organism, of how it normally runs, starts to get unbalanced.
Hmm. Well, yes, hyper-reflexivity is very interesting because that's clearly a kind of attractor here on the landscape that is not optimal, and it's something I'm aware of having experienced. It's at one point in my practice when I was doing a lot of traditional Theravada-style mindfulness, or mindfulness of the sort that you just described, the five aggregates, and it translated in certain circumstances, especially off retreat, into a kind of heightened self-consciousness. I'd walk into a Starbucks and, paying for coffee, and what I had there was not a radical freedom from self-concern and free attention for that encounter. I had a supercharged self-awareness that was, seemed fairly neurotic, albeit concentrated. And that's just a spot on the landscape that one wants to avoid. I mean, I think one wants to be aware that it's possible, but it doesn't strike me as necessary to ever hit that, because again, the goal of mindfulness is not to become merely hyper aware of yourself. The goal is to actually, and again, thought interacts with this, quite unhelpfully. Again, in most of those experiences, you're going to be thinking without knowing that you're thinking, i.e., you're not actually going to be mindful, but you actually want to be free of your self-concern in those moments. You actually want the free attention to simply pay attention to the world and pay attention to other people. When someone's talking to you, you don't want micro attention to your internal states competing with your listening to what they're saying. You just want to be able to truly listen to what they're saying in a wide open way. And those are different channels to be on. And granted, it can take some doing to avoid kind of getting on the wrong one, I would say, especially when one is practicing in certain ways intensively.
Yeah, I think that makes sense in that there can be both practice-specific effects that an approach in one tradition might have a tendency to lead to more of this heightened, metacognitive micro-awareness of one's interiority, one's emotional states, physical sensations, and whatnot, as well as what's going on in the world. And then there might be other views and values where, well, that's not really the goal or the approach, and rather the goal is this more absorbed into the immediate object within the external world, and that the self is attenuated through that process. And something like a flow state or some deep state of absorption where the sense of one's own interiority becomes it becomes more transparent perhaps rather than like heightened, in the sense that you're not necessarily paying attention to, body posture or, your internal temperature or what even emotions you're necessarily feeling, but you're really there with the conversation or the object that's there in the world. So I agree that both of those states are possible, and they are certainly the case that one, a hyper aware one in a certain context, like of a great intense environmental stimulus or something, might be the wrong match, and that there's a certain utility to being able to have that kind of absorption. I think the challenge then becomes in meditation instructions, of the kind in your app and elsewhere, where there is this, the basic, project that you're describing is this kind of attention to one's own, interiority, to understand how these experiences are aspects of conscious experience, is to how to make sure to steer it in one direction, like rather than another, I suppose.
Yeah, well, for me, well, actually, maybe we can do it through the lens that Willoughby just provided in talking about emotion and the kind of ownership of it and the half-life of it. Because this is one of the what I consider to be the near-term gains of any kind of mature mindfulness practice, even short of losing a sense of self in any sense, the ability to notice that negative emotions degrade very, very quickly if you pay attention to them in a certain way. If you get out of your thoughts around, the reasons why you're angry and have every right to be angry or anxious and, should be anxious, and you just become interested in the physiology of these emotions and let that physiology just degrade, people begin to notice that they can choose essentially how long they want to stay angry for, right? And that becomes an immensely freeing thing. Again, before anything more profound or spooky happens, along the path, the traditional path of having any kind of Buddhist or contemplative insights. And I guess there's a possibility that one could take that kind of thing too far and notice that one can kind of stamp on positive emotions too. I think, just empirically speaking, and this comes from the literature and it, just comes from my own experience, there seems to be a kind of happy bias in consciousness itself that need not have been so. It's kind of a happy accident that the less you spend time lost in thought and reacting to everything, and the more you can just kind of rest in a non-reactive way and accept experience as it comes, you don't become more and more anxious and agitated and impatient. You become more tranquil and peaceful and joyful and compassionate, or at least open to the positive end in a way that you're not open to the negative end. I mean, the negative end, things like anger and impatience seem to require an identification with thought and reactivity in a way that joyful, in the literature, this becomes a stronger claim of like kind of an intrinsic blissfulness to the nature of awareness. And, again, I think there's some evidence for that, but that could just be that to be in touch with it is to be concentrated in a way that is selecting for a kind of blissfulness. But it does seem like there's not an equivalent danger that one will nullify one's joys and one's feelings of compassion by precisely the same route that one is nullifying one's impatience and capacity to be a jerk. So I don't know if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think we both do. Mine's pretty brief, which is that, I wonder if those states of bliss and joy, while, yeah, I think it makes sense, as you say, that those are not going to be born of identification with thought, I wonder if there is more an identification at some level. It could be, fairly subtle, with either body sensations or emotions. That these positive experiences that are well associated with becoming more concentrated and some attenuation of thought. Part of what is heightened in that, generally when it's practiced through something like taking the breath as an object, is a heightened awareness of our bodily senses of self and perhaps even our affective sense of self. So, and I think here's where there's some difference in what one is supposed to do with that. In some traditions, there's notions that states of bliss that are arising are also just transitory meditation experiences that are decidedly not to be identified with.
Yeah.
And then there's other, path models where, they can be recruited in some way, or there's other statements that identify them with, the nature of mind or Buddha nature. But I wonder if here there's some sort of imbalance or asymmetry in terms of what one is disidentifying from versus what one is, at least maybe even in a tacit way, identifying with in response.
Right. The identification with those meditative states is, as you say, it's a kind of a well-described pitfall ultimately on the path in some of these traditions. I guess what I was referencing more was just the claim that the state of being disidentified, what's left as just the feeling tone of consciousness seems to be positively valenced. It's not just nothing. It's not like you've canceled your happiness in precisely the same moment that you canceled your suffering, or at least that's not what is advertised.
It's certainly not what is advertised, and it's clearly not what you experience, but I wonder whether that's enough to say that the feeling tone of consciousness itself is positive. And I do wonder about the asymmetry of that you can disidentify from thoughts in general, and that will only decrease negative emotions and not positive ones. I mean, the amygdala doesn't really care. It detects emotional salience, positive and negative. So if you're decreasing the activity of the amygdala, it's going to be both positive and negative. And there's lots of data to show that meditation decreases the valence across the board, regardless of whether it's positive or negative, and in experts and novices. So I do think that's...
Well, let me muck this
Yeah.
picture up a little bit more. We can add some more variables here because I think, so again, most people will be lost in thought most of the time anyway, no matter how much they practice. I certainly count myself among those people. So what happens, there's an asymmetry in how one applies the remedy as well. So like when things are going great, when I'm just, having fun with my kids or doing something that's bringing me obvious joy, I'm not disposed to, like my mindfulness alarm hasn't gone off to say, okay, attention, we want to let go of all this, right? Whereas when I'm being provoked to anger, sitting in traffic or, looking at my Twitter feed, the alarm does go off or goes off eventually. And then I'm letting the emotion degrade. But if we flipped it around, I could do the same for joy with my kids just as diligently. And then that could push me somewhere that would seem non-optimal from the point of view of being a parent.
Right. I mean, what I'm hearing is the idea that, disidentification from thought will shorten the duration of emotions. So given that is a fantastic thing to know and a fantastic tool if you want to increase or decrease certain emotions. So I think that to me seems like a better thing to teach people is like, here's a tool that can increase or decrease your emotions, use as you want, rather than saying you're not being mindful if you're not knowing that you're thinking, and that you should always be mindful, and being mindful all the time is going to make things better all the time. That's not true. So why not give people all these different tools of ways to upregulate and downregulate and have all these different ways of being, and then they can choose how to use them.
Well, so then this brings us to the non-monotonicity question of the path and the goal here. So what you just prescribed will work fine for somebody who has the tools in hand and hasn't used them too much, right? So you're lost in thought much of the time, and you can use your mindfulness, even your self-transcending mindfulness, as needed, and you'll decide to use them presumably when you feel bad, and you're going to stop feeling bad more or less when you want. Sometimes you're not going to want to stop feeling bad because it seems warranted based on what's actually happening in the world, and you want to be motivated by those feelings, and you can just sort of drive along the path however you want. But it seems that at a certain point of practice, certain things could be so obvious, the illusoriness of the self, or the shortened half-life of any conceivable emotion, that you're left with a process that you can't unring the bell of insight, right? And you will see certain things about the nature of your mind more or less all the time. And if in fact full enlightenment is the state of never overlooking these things again for any reason, well then this will just be obvious all the time. And whatever this is, it's certainly advertised to be a very positive outcome. It is synonymous with a kind of radical psychological freedom and an availability of some very pro-social emotions like compassion, without impediment. Again, this is the advertisement. And I must say, in my own experience, insofar as I can stay in this place for significant periods of time, well, I would be surprised if the advertisements are completely in error, right? Or if all of this turns a corner into just stark, affectless zombiehood. Is an open question for me whether there's a too much of a good thing principle here waiting to be discovered by anyone who takes the path as far as it can be taken. Also, you would expect, I don't know, Willoughby, and I don't know how much time you've spent around the people who have seemed to have taken this as far as anyone. What's your experience of, the most experienced meditators and lamas and roshis you've hung out with? I mean, again, this brings in another conversation that we don't have time for, but which is fascinating, that the misadventures of various teachers with their students and the ethical problems that one encounters there is fascinating, and I think is often explained by people who, again, are more ordinary than has been advertised, thrust into positions of power, and suddenly able to gratify their desires in ways that they could never have imagined, coming from Tibet or wherever they were found. But in your experience of the most senior people, the people who've put in their 30,000 hours, what's your sense of where this is all terminating?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't Willoughby, obviously. This is Jared, but because I was wanting to follow up on the prior question, so maybe we can bracket that one for just a second.
Go for it.
And yeah, I mean, I think that probably the more immediate concern for, again, keeping in mind this audience of, app users, is going to be more along the circumstantial application that you were describing, that these principles are really useful for applying when negative emotions arise or rumination arises, and you want to get some space around those things and maybe even reduce their duration, and probably aren't going to be naturally applied to investigating the impermanence of the joy that is arising in the context of delightful experiences of fatherhood that you described. So I think naturally there is going to be kind of I think there is in the general meditation marketplace a kind of valence bias that these practices are useful for reducing negative emotions and enhancing positive emotions, and there's that kind of there's an intention there that may not even be necessarily explicit, but that is kind of shaping, if not when the instructions are applied, I guess, how pervasively or how strongly they're applied, or when somebody feels a need to apply them, or when their life is going on just fine. And I think I would also suggest that the same can be true for sense of self, especially given that what we've been talking about earlier, that self can refer to multiple types of experiences, multiple levels of selfhood, some of which have pretty evident implications in negative experiences, again, like rumination and perseveration, or just being attached to things that are happening that one could let go of. But there's also a lot of ways in which we need to embody certain aspects of our selfhood in a regular basis, and maybe hold them with a little bit more lightness or have some more flexibility around them than we often do. But I guess a concern, given what we've seen in our data set, is again the kind of over application of the principle that because it's possible within the context of a meditation experience to feel like there is no self identified with body, or that emotions are arising and passing on their own, so those aren't me either, or that I'm not an agent of my actions, intentions are just arising, or even some traditions that really investigate consciousness also as fundamentally not me. That that those kinds of experiences that can arise in that context of meditation, I think that for most people, they're probably not going to be skillfully applied if those are also considered to be the ideal state for daily life. Whether advanced meditators are able to kind of make that integration such that they truly have like no sense of self at all of these levels, but they also are truly not dysfunctional. I don't rule that out, a priori as a possibility. I don't know that it's been validated or verified. There's been, very few studies that within the meditation literature in general that have shown a strong relationship between diminishments in selfhood and positive outcome, in part because we're still so confused about how to measure selfhood. But I think that right now it's kind of taken on faith. And as you say, it's the ideal that's put forth within the tradition. It may be possible. I think people should just ask themselves, like, is that the ideal around which I want to orient my life? Is that going to serve me well? Or is there some other way of being on the path still that might not require that degree of, commitment to the application of the alleged ideal in every moment?
Yeah, I mean, the one wrinkle I see there is that the crucial insight that I'm talking about, which, for me was the there for meditation, it's something you can overlook by accident because you get entangled with thought and your life, right? Your kind of outwardly going attention, but it's not something you can overlook on purpose, right? I mean, to tell someone, it's analogous to telling someone not to be mindful. That's synonymous with telling them to be mindful, right? So it's like either you've noticed this thing about the nature of consciousness or you haven't. And if you have, you can't intentionally overlook it. You can just forget about it because you're no longer being mindful. But, for me, again, this is not a problem because the thing that I'm noticing, at least for me, has no discernible negative consequences. And in fact, it's the thing that, if noticed, will allow me to unhook from obvious psychological suffering. And, most psychological suffering that I can detect in myself is the result of losing sight of this thing. This is the sort of absence of self that I'm talking about. And again, it's not every possible absence of self. It certainly doesn't negate a sense of, personal continuity with one's past, right? So like I don't feel just as much like you as I feel like me. But the sense of having the center drop out, the sense that there's a thinker in addition to thoughts, having that drop out or having its absence be salient. At a certain point in practice, that becomes a default that you can't undo, for better or worse. It seems very, very much for better in my case. And again, that's how it's advertised, but it is a kind of point of no return, or at least seems to be for me. And it's also very much not the state of identified dissociation that you just described, actually, just kind of a way of practicing, like, my hand is not me, my emotions are not me, even consciousness is not me. But like in every moment that one is doing that, there seems to be a me, the meditator, the attender who's divorcing himself or herself from phenomena. That's the thing that has to go in order for anatta, selflessness, to actually be felt. But again, there's nothing necessarily to do with this claim I'm making. I'm just saying I see a point where it's not just elective anymore. You can't, if you told me to feel like I had an ego in my head, I couldn't do it because that's synonymous with saying, take a look for the ego in your head that isn't there, right? If that were a bad thing, if it led to some kind of functional impairment or psychological suffering, that would be a bad outcome of this whole process. And I wouldn't see how you would reconstruct from there, right? Because it just is a fact of the nature of consciousness that there is no thinker in the middle thinking the thoughts. There's no homunculus in there.
I mean, and you have found that for you personally, seeing through that homunculus has been very helpful. And I think a lot of people have found that to be true, but I guess I wonder like whether that necessarily is universal.
It's a good question. I think it's, from my point of view, I can't see how it would be the basis of suffering or an impairment of function. I mean, there are many other things in this area, methodologically, that I can see producing suffering and impairment of function. But this particular insight seems kind of intrinsically benign to me. I mean, it's sort of on the order of noticing that thoughts arise and pass away, right? Like the highly non-analogous, but and just the recognition that every time you've been angry or worried or impatient in the past, that has come to an end at some point. There's some psychological strength to be taken from there. But, some morbid person can flip that around and say, well, every joy and moment of pleasure has also come to an end. And so what's the point? Why don't I just kill myself? So yeah, you can kick open the door to anhedonia or depression there. But again, this is all the character of what somebody is very actively doing with their minds in order to suffer down those paths. We're talking about doing more here rather than just having any particular insight. Now, though my mindfulness is immature, I'm increasingly mindful of your time here. We've gone a full 2 hours. So I think this is a fascinating conversation, and we've really just started. So just to close out, one of my motives in having this conversation with you both in the first place was to figure out what resources were available to people who have bad experiences in meditation and even bad experiences with my app. And I know you hear from people from many traditions, and you've actually heard from some people who have been using the Waking Up course and feel that they've been destabilized in some of the ways we've been talking about. And so I think you have at least one email there that you can read, Willoughby. And could you read that now so that just we have a sense of what you're experiencing on your end?
Sure. This is one I got the most recently. This says, Dear Cheetah House, I am writing seeking help with negative experiences resulting from meditation. I have started experiencing distress, dissociation leading to constant panic, and I'm at a loss at how to begin to de escalate or find calm with what is happening to me. I would be so grateful for any guidance you could offer me. There is so little information out there about negative responses to meditation, and especially what to do if you encounter them. Here's my situation. I started using the Waking Up app from Sam Harris and following his course. I'm about 2/3 of the way through it. I believe the anxiety I'm experiencing is to do with his deconstruction of the components that make up a consistent experience of the self. I have begun to feel, as others have said, like I'm watching all the parts of myself operate without existing among them. I am struggling to reconcile this feeling that the self is illusory without extreme panic. It's like being on a hallucinatory drug trip from which one can't wake up. I feel like I'm losing my mind and going mad, and I don't know how to ground myself." And then he followed up and said, "I don't have a history of mental illness."
Right. So obviously, this is the kind of thing that I would like to do anything I can to prevent or respond to intelligently. And so this conversation is a first effort at that. Willoughby, you'll tell us what resources exist in the world and on your side that I can point people toward. I mean, the only thing I would point out here is that we have a large numbers effect here, right? So that anything I put out there conceivably could have an email like this associated with it. This is not to discount the significance of the distress this person is feeling, but I mean, I can just guarantee you that if we asked everyone who read my book, Free Will, or even The End of Faith, or really any of my books, whether they had had a life crisis on its basis, we could find those emails as well. I mean, this comes with the territory, but I'm, acutely aware of not having resources myself to direct people toward if they have an experience like this. So, Willoughby, what do you have for us?
So I receive a lot of emails from app users, the Waking Up app, as well as lots of other apps, and hear stories like this one, as well as a lot of other kinds of problems.
Could you just, Willoughby, could you just give me a
Yep.
sense of the scale of it? Because like how many emails like that would you say you've received from Waking Up users?
I think I've gotten about 5 from Waking Up users,
Okay.
and I get probably 3 emails a week, and on average, and then if there's a news story, then there's a big bump and there's more. So for people who are having trouble with meditation in general or an app specifically, I run a nonprofit called Cheetah House, cheetahhouse.org, cheetah like the animal, and Cheetah House, all one word, 2 H's. And we offer, support services for meditators in crisis. It could be loss of sense of self. It could be a lot of other things. So anything related to meditation, we can handle. We have online weekly support groups that cross 9 time zones, and also referral services to other places. So it's the beginning of a more comprehensive service.
Awesome. Is this a nonprofit? Do you guys take outside funding, or is it just a fee for service model? What's going on there in terms of running the business?
Right now, it's just a fee for service model. For any kind of donation that would go through